Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Comment allez-vous? Or something like that. Well, I'm going to talk today about Quebec and Montreal, and I imagine many of you have been there one time or the other, but these are the two major cities of eastern Canada and particularly the province of Quebec. And I, I'm going to talk to you about this in a sort of historical context because Quebec is, above all, a conflicted part of Canada because of the war between Great Britain and France for the territory that led to the development of the rest of the continent. And though the New France is historical, it is very much a real society and a real culture here that endures. And as you know, it's a bilingual nation by law. I told my little Canadian joke about the lifeguard who couldn't swim, but he could speak French also, so he got the job. I'm sure there are less amusing tales like that. I was just reading the newspapers today about the continued separation movement in independence movement for Quebec. Though it's let's say it's always an argument but a peaceful dispute, and it has yet to come to pass. I'm going to show you different things about Quebec, Montreal, that will just give you a briefing about where we're going. First of all, this is a vast land, and it stretches almost 1,000 miles north to south, this great province. Not the largest of Canada, but it's certainly for the east, it's so much bigger than Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, or Labrador is to the right of the screen along the rough coast on the North Atlantic. And Quebec is really the valley of what they used to call Lower Canada, meaning the lower river valley of the St. Lawrence. But the population is almost all just along the river. On the Laurentine side, on the both banks between Quebec and Montreal out to Gaspé, that's 95% of the population of this vast province. There are about 8 million people in the entire province, but there are almost 2 million square miles. So other than these few towns and a couple of large cities, most of Quebec is well, we would call it wilderness, but the First Nations, the Cree and the Micmac, Algonquin people think this is not wilderness, this is our home. However long they have had visitors from afar. But you see, Ontario and the capital Ottawa are just past Montreal, and then that becomes the English-speaking part of the rest of Canada. But this is the flag of Quebec. You'll see flying proudly everywhere with the fleur-de-lis and the echo of the imperial flag of pre-revolutionary France. Here is the motto or the armoire of Quebec, and you notice Je me souviens. You'll see that on the license plates also, which in French means I remember. And so this historical grievances of the French speech, of the Quebecois, they're called, is very palpable. And you'll find them as individually they may be friendly, but generally they are fairly standoffish unless you speak French, and not just Parisian French, but Quebecois. They're somewhat of an insular people culturally because of the aggrievement of their conquest, which goes back. Well, they share that with the First Nations, the Algonquins, the Micmac, even the Inuit in the very far north on the Arctic side of it. And so when the first explorers came, they encountered people who were initially quite friendly until the colonists started to come in and take more territory. And as a typical conflict, the Indians, the natives, however you want to call them, would help the first visitors, but as more and more they came and they claimed property rights and religious missionaries, the conflicts rolled on from then till now. Even the word Canada is an Algonquin word for a village on the river. And so Canada is, to its credit, has sort of redressed some of the historical grievances and given historical credence to the First Nations and given them some compensation for some of the troubles that they have had over the years. But this is one of the early villages on the shores of the St. Lawrence River, which was a stockaded little fortress with a sort of a small town in the middle of it. So the first French explorers were quite interested that these people had settled towns, they had agriculture, then they went out hunting and traveling. Of course, there are many different kinds of natives all across Canada, so that the life was not always the same, but they are still here. This is a village of the Cree, Namisquah, which is in far north Quebec, so that once you've left the St. Lawrence River Valley, over half of Quebec is, the people there are mostly Cree and other descendants of the First Nations, however mixed in they are. Well, this is even echoed in, this is in Montreal, where the Quebec Parliament is, and they have put up a monument which is called a Inukshuk, which is the marker for the Inuit people up on the Arctic plains and seaside of northern Quebec. And you'll see that all through the Arctic across all of northern Canada. And as part of the linguistic arguments about, well, is it going to be French or English? Well, the First Nations have insisted that they have their language also, and they be given equal respect, which of course galls the French speakers. Well, a lot of Quebec is lush in the summer. I'm just going to show you a few pictures of what it looks like. We're here for the beautiful foliage, but very soon it turns dark and cold and icy, and so you have a lot of sort of frozen villages and land. I mean, this is vast, vast land that goes up. The major industries inland are either mining or hydroelectric, and so there are very big mining operations in Quebec. This is a Rio Tinto operation of aluminum, so they take out bauxite, and the hydroelectric development, a lot of it is to smelt aluminum and refine other ores. So this is a major industry of Quebec. There used to be very large fisheries along the river, much of which has diminished, as I described in other talks. But you can appreciate how frozen and cold it gets. But if you're a real Canadian, you like the cold. And there's a saying in Quebec is, when the winter begins, the fun begins. Because the summer, however warm and lush it is, that means you're growing agriculture or you're traveling. But when the first freeze comes, particularly when the river freezes, stops all the transit traditionally, that's when everybody gets to stay home, read, write, play music, have handicrafts, and that's where the family gathers together. So this northern culture reinforces, let's say, family bonds and community bonds just by the cold, not your Florida lifestyle. Well, anyway, this is what it can be. And of course, back in the days before we thought we should go to work every day in the winter, you get to stay home. Now they dig their way out and have traffic jams, even in the worst of blizzards. And so here's just another day in Quebec in the winter. And this is the symbol of Quebec, the snowy owl, which is, of course, a very a bit ferocious of a bird, but it'll find the winter rodents in the snow. Well, before and still to this day, there was a great deal of forestry. Now, a lot of the immediate forests have been cut for shipbuilding and for export. This was a major source for timber for Britain and the rest of Europe for a while. Now the second growth forests are not as commercially valuable as construction timber, but there's a great deal of pulp timber for producing newspapers and other industrial products. So this is what the St. Lawrence looked like at Quebec back 100 years ago or so, when the great rafts of wood pulp and timber would come down right to the river for processing or being shipped out. You don't see that much anymore. Well, here's an old picture of the Quebecois, the residents. And the province has the distinction between the urban centers, which are along the river, Quebec, Montreal being the largest, and then all of the vast countryside. And the further upland you go, the more isolated the communities were, the more insular they were. And I mentioned this the other day, the French that is spoken in Quebec is antique French with a lot of local variation. So if you have any friends from Quebec and you try to speak what high school French you might have learned, you'll find very quickly that it is not really the same language. Written is very similar, of course, but the slang and the local patois, they call it, is very strong, especially up in the farther reaches of Quebec. So these are just scenes of life in these villages, which particularly centered around the church. And so I would say that the development of Quebec had a cultural basis, a religious basis, and then a certain amount of industry and determination in the face of what is a very difficult climate if you're not used to the bitter frozen cold. Now, this is a homestead right along the St. Lawrence River back in a previous century, but I show this because the land use was made in long strips so that every homesteader would be given a grant of land that would have a waterfront, and then a long strip of land that would be farming and then go back up into the woodlands, so that the sort of egalitarian land distribution, often under a French noble patent, would be given to the colonists, but they'd get these long strips of land, which you can see today. If you fly out of Montreal, you go up in the air, if it's a clear day, you'll see that all the farms are sort of pencil strips across the land. That comes from the requirement that everybody have access to the great St. Lawrence River for commerce. So this is a more modern scene of the same. And then all along the river, you'll see the almost medieval style French architecture, which remains silos or watchtowers or fortifications. And even this is an agricultural research institute at Saint-Hyacinthe, which is typical of Quebec. They preserve some of the older architecture of France, and then, of course, have modernized. But in some ways, the Quebecois are more French than the French in their pride. Well, the city of Quebec was founded in 1608, making it the oldest city in the Americas, North America, I should say, only matched by some towns in the Caribbean started by the Spanish. So it was Samuel de Champlain who came up and came to the narrowing of the river. And the word Quebec means in Algonquin where the river narrows. Now, it's still navigable up to Montreal, but this became the strategic fortress and protector for New France. And Quebec City was built into the fortress that it remains to this day, like my first picture on the title. And so the ramparts and the castles and such are still there, though they've been, let's say, added to over the years. And but it's a geographic strong point, which is why Quebec City became the capital of New France. And it was very busy bringing in settlers and shipping out goods. And this is the Baville, like the lower city, which remains to this day. We'll be docking right there at that point, which is a historic preserve in that area. And then the upper town is the modern city. Well, this conflict between Britain and France during the 7 Years' War and other conflicts meant that as a sideshow to all the other battles in Europe, the British came and demanded that the French surrender. And this is the famous meeting of the Quebec, New France Governor Frontenac with the representative of William Pitt. And so you can see how gentlemen got dressed for business back in those days. It just isn't quite the Quaker suit. As if my wig is bigger than your wig. That's how it was argued. Well, the British were very ready to fight over this, because if they could not control Quebec and the St. Lawrence Valley, that meant that the whole access to the center of the continent would be French, and then would circle the British colonies from New Orleans all the way up to the French settlement of Detroit and all of the rivers in between, and then coming out the St. Lawrence River. So as sort of the geopolitical game of the time, the British felt they had to take Quebec and close off the river from the French, lest they had the war would go on in many other places. Now, this was in 1690, but in 1759, in September, the fleet arrived after having forced the surrender and the siege of Fort Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. Then the Royal Navy came up and worked its way up the river, partly due to the excellent cartography of Captain James Cook, who made charts that allowed the longboats to know where to go, where to land. And then they had the famous storming of the Plains of Abraham behind the city of Quebec, the fortress of it, and they mounted up on the hill and then came down on the upper city and the fortress and laid siege and forced the surrender of the French forces under Marquis de Montcalm. Now, this was James Wolfe, the British commander, and his opponent, Montcalm, they were aristocratic military officers who were sent into this battle. And back in those days, of course, war was somewhat more formalized. They'd stand and wave their flags and shoot their cannons and charge. But they were not of what they call the rascally natives who would hide behind trees and camouflage themselves and all that, all the things of modern warfare that were a result of the American wars. But they did not really like this duty, of course. And Marquis de Montcalm, in his earlier writings, he said, "New France is a place where rogues get rich and honest men are rewarded." And then even General Wolfe called his own soldiers rascals and scum of the earth. Well, that was just what they had to have to go into battle like this, perhaps. But both men were killed in the battle. And so that became legendary, that both commanders leading their troops were both shot and killed. Wolfe on the battlefield, and Montcalm later, he was wounded, mortally wounded, died later. Here's his illustration as he's led to his deathbed. But they both died in battle, and they have a common memorial in Quebec City on the Governor's Garden. Now, they were both taken back home for their internment, but the inscription on this monument says, "Valor gave them a common death, history a common fame, and posterity a common monument." So this was meant to symbolize in this tragedy that everybody should get along, which is a wishful thinking perhaps, but this struggle of Quebec continued to this day in the sense that it became a province of British North America and a province of Canada, but it has always considered itself unjustly treated by that very conquest in 1759. That's why they still have this, the provincial saying, "Je me souviens," I remember, or rather, I'll never forget. And these wounds continue to be salted regularly by the political debates in Quebec. And so Quebec became such a large part of now the British Empire, uncomfortably so. But then the next thing that happened, of course, was that pesky rebels in the 13 colonies that then led the Loyalists to leave. Many of them went to Ontario, of course, others went to Nova Scotia. A few came to Montreal. So Montreal became actually a partly English-speaking town at the time because of all the Loyalists coming from the colonies. And then the debate went on. They had the Quebec was allowed to have its assembly, and then the royal representatives allowed the Quebecois to keep their language, keep their local laws, and sort of be semi-independent, but under the authority of the crown and the empire. But it continued to be an unsettled society because particularly out in the farther reaches of Quebec, there was resistance against taxation, against military incursions, and there were uprisings. This one was in 1837. And every time the British forces came and put down any of the Quebec rebels, when there was a united Canadian assembly, a parliament established in Montreal, the anti-unionists, they were called, or rather the Quebec separatists, came and they burnt down the whole building. So this is the historical headache of Canada. Subsequently, there have been calls in Quebec that we really should get our independence, if not by force, but then by referendum or by application to the crown. And of course, then when Canada became its own nation, confederation, Quebec was the major part. But time and time again, the various Quebec leaders have advocated independence rather than this compromise with, first of all, Britain and then with the rest of the Canadian provinces. So here's a few of the Quebec leaders conferring on how they can do this, and it's just been a constant thorn in the side of history with their eloquent speakers, Bourassa being one of about 120 years ago, who was elected the premier of Quebec. Most famously, René Lévesque was the last premier of Quebec who advocated complete independence, and it was closely defeated in a referendum back in the late 1970s. But here's a statue again in Quebec City. But this pride and yearning for independence goes on in Quebec. however difficult it would be in practicality. Well, the other aspect of the society